Brought to you by Thomas Allgaier and Frennies, this edition highlights key LinkedIn posts on next-gen vehicle intelligence in weeks 11 and 12. Frennies supports Tier 1 automotive suppliers with early-stage market validation for their R&D efforts by combining secondary research, direct OEM expert interviews, and facilitated customer meetings. You can find more info in the description.
Imagine waking up, getting ready for work, walking out to your driveway, and you just find out your car is completely bricked.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I mean, the engine won't start, the doors barely unlock, and you are just stranded. And here is the real kicker. Your car didn't actually break down, and your automaker didn't even make a mistake.
Wait, really?
Yeah, a third-party vendor that you have probably never even heard of got hacked overnight. And last week, that exact nightmare paralyzed, like 150,000 drivers. So, well, welcome to the deep dive.
We are so glad you are joining us today. We have basically combed through the absolute top next-gen vehicle intelligence trends that really dominated LinkedIn during calendar weeks 11 and 12.
Right, just cutting through all the noise.
Exactly. We are skipping the fluff to give you the actual signal here.
Yeah.
So we are going to take a really fast-paced, focused look at the massive shift toward open source software platforms, the rise of the AI-driven vehicle.
It's just huge right now.
It really is. And then we will get into the incredibly gritty reality of continuous safety, and finally, the hidden human bottlenecks of autonomy that, the industry is desperately trying to ignore.
Yeah, they really are. Let's just jump straight into the foundation, though, because the very architecture of modern mobility is totally shifting away from those proprietary, walled-off silos.
Right.
A massive story that was dominating conversations over the past 2 weeks is Google officially open-sourcing the Android Automotive OS for software-defined vehicles.
Right. You will usually see it referred to online as AOS SDV.
Exactly.
And executives like Matt Crowley and Samir Samad have been extremely vocal about this on LinkedIn recently. They're framing it as this massive ecosystem shifting move.
Yeah, totally.
But, we really need to unpack why this matters so much to you listening at home. Because historically, car makers have just been, terrified of software fragmentation.
Oh, absolutely terrified.
And Samir Samad pointed out that this transition actually mirrors the start of the smartphone era. By providing a common, open foundation, OEMs can finally just stop reinventing the wheel on, basic connectivity and HVAC controls.
Right, and they can actually focus their engineering power on the user experience instead.
Exactly.
To really visualize the mechanics of why this fragmentation has been such a nightmare for them, look at the analogy Julian Emma shared in his post. I mean, it is perfect.
Oh, the Lego one?
Yeah, the Lego one. He described building car software like trying to assemble a giant Lego set, but all the pieces are sourced from dozens of completely different boxes.
Right, which sounds awful.
It is, because a braking sensor from one supplier speaks a totally different code language than, the infotainment screen from another supplier. So because of that, car makers are forced to spend massive amounts of time and capital just integrating those pieces.
Yeah.
Writing all these custom translation layers rather than actually innovating on the vehicle itself.
Which perfectly explains why Google's AAOS SDV is being labeled across the whole industry as a CAPEX killer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, because if you don't have to pay hundreds of engineers to write translation code for a proprietary operating system, you completely bypass those massive plumbing investments.
Right, the plumbing is already done.
Exactly. And Izer Erdem actually noted that Renault is already leveraging this platform for their upcoming vehicles. And Qualcomm is actively helping to scale it by delivering a pre-integrated stack.
Wow, already?
Yeah, they're moving fast. And the mechanism here is crucial because this enables much faster over-the-air or OTA updates for the core car functions.
Right, so we're not just talking about updating the Spotify app on your dashboard.
No, exactly. We are talking about updating the actual mechanical and comfort functions of the car seamlessly.
I want to pause and challenge the long-term reality of that smartphone analogy you mentioned earlier, though.
Okay, lay it on me.
Because if you think back to the early smartphone wars, the hardware manufacturers think, Motorola or HTC, who eagerly gave up their OS layer to a tech giant, they largely just became commoditized.
Right, that is true.
So if legacy OEMs just hand over the foundational OS layer to a tech giant like Google just to save on integration costs, do they risk becoming, nothing more than the hardware shell for someone else's software ecosystem?
That is the existential dread keeping legacy automaker executives awake at night, right?
It has to be.
Because if the plumbing belongs to Google, what is your differentiator? You basically have to compete entirely on the intelligence sitting on top of that plumbing.
Right.
Because if an open source OS solves the plumbing of a software-defined vehicle, the industry has already realized that just having good plumbing isn't enough. We have to talk about the brain.
Yeah, we do. And Sean Seri pointed out an incredibly sobering timeline regarding this. He noted that the entire software-defined vehicle era, which was really just about basic architecture and being able to update features after a car ships, he says it effectively ended in January.
Wait, really? Just like that?
Just like that. The industry language has already moved on. Now it is all about the AI-defined vehicle, or AAV.
Okay, let's clarify the difference there for the listener, just so we are all on the same page.
Yeah, good idea.
So an SDV update improves a static feature, right? Maybe it just changes the layout of your digital dashboard.
Sure.
But an AI update actually improves how the vehicle makes decisions. An AD can reason, it can adapt to its environment, and it genuinely gets smarter after leaving the factory.
Exactly. Like it learns that a specific intersection is always icy in the morning, and it just adjusts its torque distribution dynamically.
Right, that is a huge leap.
It is. And honestly, nobody illustrated the aggressive power grab in this new AV space better than NVIDIA at their recent GTC 2026 event.
Oh, I saw some posts about that.
Yeah, Augustin Friedel broke down NVIDIA's strategy in a way that should honestly terrify traditional Tier 1 suppliers, because NVIDIA is no longer just selling silicon chips.
Right, they're doing so much more now.
Yeah, they are providing the entire underlying substrate for cars. I mean, they're offering the Hyperion 10 hardware, the Alpamayo 1.5 AI brain, and the Halos Safety OS.
Wow, the whole package.
The whole package. And Philip Rash mapped this out using a brilliant concept he calls the AV sandwich.
I love that term. The AV sandwich is just a perfect visualization of the new value chain.
It really is.
So for the listener, in this sandwich, a company like Uber controls the customer access. They're the cost layer.
Okay.
And then NVIDIA controls the actual driving technology and the AI grain, so they are the bottom layer.
Right.
So where does that leave a legacy OEM like Mercedes or Stellantis?
Mine's stuck in the middle.
Exactly. They're stuck right in the middle. They are literally just supplying the metal and the rubber for the robotaxis. They are the meat and the sandwich, basically getting squeezed out of the high-margin software revenue by these tech giants on both sides.
Wow, that is a highly precarious position to be in.
It really is.
And at that same event, NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, stood on stage and essentially called this the ChatGPT moment for self-driving cars.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, his premise is that AI models can now generalize and reason through complex driving tasks rather than just relying on like millions of lines of hard-coded if-then rules that human engineers created.
I have to throw a massive red flag on that hype, to be honest.
Absolutely.
And H. Manguino posted a really fantastic takedown of that exact phrase on LinkedIn. Calling it a ChatGPT moment is like super seductive for investors, but it is incredibly dangerous in reality.
Yeah, the stakes are just a bit different.
Right. Let's just look at the mechanics of why. ChatGPT works because if a large language model hallucinates a wrong answer, the consequence is trivial. Maybe you get a really weird recipe for chocolate chip cookies.
Right, no big deal.
But a hallucination at 70 miles per hour on a crowded highway, that is fatal.
Yeah, that is terrifying.
And Manguino asks a critical question we all need to consider here.
Yeah.
Are we confusing AI's incredible perception abilities with actual validated safety?
Man, that tension really exposes the fundamental difference between probability and determinism.
Exactly.
Because neural networks, I mean, they are extraordinary at perceiving their environment. They can look at a blurry, pixelated shape in the fog and guess with like 99% probability that it is a pedestrian.
Right.
But you cannot just be probably right when you are merging into a fast lane of traffic. You need deterministic guaranteed safety.
You really do.
And that lethal difference between probably right and guaranteed safe brings us to the absolute nightmare of how governments are actually supposed to regulate these evolving AI machines.
Yeah, just think about the car sitting in your driveway right now. How does a government regulator even begin to certify a vehicle that can literally change its underlying decision-making code overnight?
Short answer. They don't know how.
Right.
And Ozekuri Akdemir highlighted this structural paradox perfectly. He points out that OTA updates have completely broken the traditional concept of an approved system.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Historically, regulators validated a fixed physical architecture. You crash test a car, you check the brakes, you approve it, and then it just never changes.
Yeah, it was simple.
But now they are forced to approve dynamic systems where features are activated on the fly, and the configurations evolve across millions of vehicles simultaneously. So regulators are no longer validating a stable, finished product. They are basically forced to validate mere moments in time.
Wow. Which brings us right back to that horrifying scenario you opened the show with.
Oh, yeah.
Because the threat to these dynamic systems isn't just a rogue AI making a bad driving decision. It's the vulnerability of the entire interconnected supply chain.
Absolutely.
Vikas Chaudhary shared the details of that hack, and it honestly sounds like a Hollywood thriller.
It really does.
So an aftermarket breathalyzer company called Intoxilock suffered a back-end cyber attack.
Okay.
And because those ignition interlock devices are digitally connected to the vehicle's core systems, that single breach of a third-party server physically disabled 150,000 cars across 46 states for 8 straight days.
8 days? I mean, just process the cascading impact of that.
It is huge.
People couldn't get their kids to school. They couldn't get to their shifts at the hospital, all because a vendor they probably didn't even know was in their car's software stack went down.
Exactly.
It fundamentally shatters the illusion of vehicle ownership. It proves that in a highly connected ecosystem, your 2-ton vehicle is honestly only as safe as the weakest link in your digital supply chain.
Which is exactly why Abdul Alio emphasized in his post that compliance standards, specifically ASP-PCI, aren't just some expensive bureaucratic chore that engineers love to complain about.
Yeah.
He argues that SBICE is essential engineering infrastructure. He actually uses a really great analogy for this. You don't build a massive high-speed highway and then skimp on the asphalt just to save a few bucks.
No, you definitely don't.
Right. In a software-defined vehicle, the compliance frameworks are the asphalt. They dictate the rigorous testing and documentation required before a single line of code ever touches a moving vehicle.
Wow, yeah.
Because if there are potholes in your compliance, your beautifully designed AI software is just going to crash when it hits the real world.
Yeah, that is so true. But we also cannot get so lost in the cloud architecture and the software compliance that we forget these are still multi-ton kinetic objects operating in the real physical world.
Right. Physics still apply.
Exactly. Despite all this talk about AI brains, physical hardware and sensors still rule the road. Parthy Goyal-Mon and Sony Andrews' Joe Berdas both reminded the industry of a very sobering physical reality.
Which is?
No algorithm, no matter how incredibly advanced it is, can fix a blind spot that is caused by a clump of mud on a camera lens.
Man, that is such a vital pivot. Because if an AI hallucination is dangerous, the AI basically needs flawless eyes. Software cannot correct poor physics.
Precisely. When you are driving in zero visibility rain or heavy fog, optical cameras are essentially useless.
Right.
It is the radar sensors, which are processing upwards of 100 million data points per second, by the way, that take over.
100 million?
Yeah. They are the unsung heroes doing the quiet, unglamorous work of tracking targets and keeping drivers alive when human eyes fail. Great software amplifies good data, but it absolutely cannot rescue bad data.
So this creates a really massive friction point then, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Because if the software is infinitely updatable in the cloud, but the physical hardware, like the cameras, the radar, the compute limits, is permanently fixed at the factory, are OEMs just creating a multi-constraint bottleneck?
Yeah, that is the big question.
Vinicius Taduzine brought this up. He noted that the entire SDV development pipeline is stalling out right now.
Yeah.
And it is not because of one single bottleneck like bad code, but because of these misaligned constraints.
Right.
You have agile software ambitions constantly slamming into physical testing limits and rigid legacy supplier ecosystems.
And that exact tension between agile software and rigid legacy infrastructure, that perfectly explains the massive execution gap we are currently seeing between European and Chinese automakers.
So it really does.
It is fascinating to watch this play out on a global scale, because it's not that European engineers lack talent, It is purely a gap in execution and tooling.
Yuchao Luo hit the nail on the head regarding this gap. If you are an engineer listening to this, you will definitely feel this in your bones.
Oh yeah, prepare yourself.
He pointed out that European Tier 1 suppliers are hiring thousands of top-tier software developers to catch up in the AI race.
Okay, sounds good so far.
Right, but then they force those brilliant engineers to spend 60% of their work week updating JIRA tickets and manually filling out Excel traceability matrices just to prove compliance.
60%. That is insane.
It is. They are paying premium salaries for what is basically administrative data entry.
Meanwhile, Chinese EV makers like NIO and BYD, they have built their entire tool chains specifically for the SDV era.
Right.
They automate their compliance directly through their CI/CD pipelines.
Okay, let's explain how that works for the listener.
Sure. So continuous integration and continuous deployment means that the moment a developer writes a line of code to, say, adjust a vehicle's braking logic, the system automatically runs it through thousands of simulated physics tests.
Wow.
Automatically. The compliance is proved by the machine, not by a human filling out a spreadsheet, so their engineers get to spend their time actually innovating.
And the real-world result of that tooling difference is staggering. Alex Elliott shared a striking example of what this actually looks like in practice.
Oh, I read this post. It was wild.
Yeah, so a Leapmotor C10 experienced a sharp, unexpected braking glitch while driving on the Autobahn in Germany.
Okay.
And the driver, who actually happened to be an executive for the company, emailed the engineering team back in China before stepping into an afternoon meeting.
Right.
By the time he walked out of that meeting just a few hours later, the Chinese engineers had isolated the issue, written the code, and beamed an OTA software fix directly to the car, completely smoothing out the braking behavior.
Man, that is almost incomprehensible for a legacy automaker.
It really is.
A structural fix in hours that would traditionally take weeks, if not months, of bureaucratic approvals. They call it China speed, and it is unequivocally the new global benchmark.
Wow.
But, even if the rest of the world perfects their software speed and matches that automated CI/CD pipeline, there is still a massive hidden void when it comes to scaling true autonomy. And it's a void of human capital.
Yeah, this is where the conversation gets really counterintuitive.
Right.
Because we constantly talk about driverless cars, but we completely forget about the humans operating behind the curtain.
Yes, exactly.
Juan Carlos Aguilera ran the math on this on his LinkedIn, and the numbers are mind-blowing. If you look at the recent partnership deals, so Uber aligning with Rivian, Waymo scaling up their fleets, Bolt expanding in Europe, the industry is actively targeting a deployed fleet of over 150,000 autonomous vehicles in the very near future.
Right. But the thing is, autonomous vehicles aren't truly autonomous.
Wait, really?
No, they require constant remote supervision. If an AI gets confused by, a complex construction zone or a traffic cop using hand signals, it just stops and pings a human to take over.
Right. So to actively run 150,000 AVs, Aguilera calculates the industry needs a workforce of well over 100,000 humans.
100,000?
Yes. We are talking about remote operators, sensor calibrators, hub crews, and specialized maintenance techs. These are highly skilled jobs that require intense concentration, managing long periods of absolute boredom that are just punctuated by seconds of high-stakes crisis when the AI throws its hands up.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly stressful.
And the huge problem is those jobs barely exist today. There is no pipeline for this talent right now.
It is a massive scaling bottleneck that basically nobody is budgeting for. And Aguilera actually compares this impending workforce crisis to the 1980s offshore oil industry.
Oh, that is an interesting comparison.
Yeah, right. Because back then, when deep water drilling exploded, the oil companies didn't have a trained workforce either. It was completely the Wild West.
Wow.
So these fiercely competing oil companies actually had to come together to create the OPITO standard. It was a unified industry-wide certification for offshore workers. And Aguilera argues that AV companies absolutely must do the same thing.
That makes total sense.
Right. They need a shared transferable credential for remote operators, or they simply will not have the humans required to monitor their multi-billion-dollar robotaxi fleets.
Let's look at how this shift is already reflecting in the physical design of the cars themselves, too. Libya Montoya made a really brilliant observation about Tesla's interior design roadmap.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, if you look at the physical progression, they moved from a standard circular steering wheel in the Model 3 to that highly controversial rectangular yoke in the Cybertruck.
Right. People had a lot of opinions on that.
They sure did. And now to the recently announced Cybercab, which lacks any steering control at all.
Crazy.
It is not just an aesthetic design choice, right? It is a physical manifestation of capability graduation. The physical driver is actively being phased out of the cabin. But to your point about the workforce, The human isn't disappearing at all. They are just being moved into a remote control center halfway across the country.
Man, it is a profound philosophical shift in how we define driving. We are literally replacing the physical act of steering a wheel with the cognitive act of remote supervision.
We really are.
But amidst all this hyper-advanced tech, the AI models reasoning like humans, the robo-taxi fleets, the remote operators, there is a really harsh reality check we need to mull over before we wrap up today.
Okay, bring us back down to earth.
Yeah.
What does the actual person buying a car think about all of this?
Well, Vanessa Vu shared some incredibly grounding data from Deloitte. When you actually survey consumers and ask them what they want, they are not asking for AI-defined vehicles.
Really?
Nope. They still prioritize the absolute fundamentals, safety, affordability, and the total cost of ownership.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and only about 25% of customers are even willing to pay for software subscriptions in their cars. So it really forces us to ask, are automakers becoming way too obsessed with building AI-defined vehicles as like a marketing buzzword for Wall Street? Right. When they should instead be using AI quietly behind the scenes to build customer-defined mobility that is simply cheaper, more reliable, and ultimately safer.
That is a phenomenal point. Are we building tech for the sake of tech, or are we actually solving the driver's problems?
Exactly.
And before we go, here's one final thought for you to chew on that builds on everything we've discussed today. We have talked endlessly about the vehicles getting exponentially smarter, learning to reason, and updating their code from the cloud.
Right.
But what happens when the physical infrastructure doesn't keep up?
Oh, wow.
If we are deploying trillion-dollar AI-defined vehicles onto analog 20th century roads with crumbling asphalt, fading painted lines, and broken stoplights, who is ultimately to blame when the system fails?
That is a great question.
Is it the highly regulated AI software? Or is it the bankrupt city planner who just couldn't afford to repaint the crosswalk? It is a huge collision between the future of software and the past of public infrastructure, and the mobility industry is going to have to answer for it soon.
They absolutely will.
If you enjoyed this episode, new episodes drop every 2 weeks. Also check out our other editions on electrification and battery technology, future mobility market evolution, and commercial fleet insights. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Make sure to subscribe, and we will see you next time.